Introduction. Blood in the Dust. The West was a land of contradictions. It was a place of boundless opportunity and relentless hardship, where the promise of freedom came hand in hand with the threat of violence. The law was a fragile thing, stretched thin across the vast, untamed frontier, and men like Silas Bartlett thrived in the cracks. Bartlett and his gang were more than outlaws. They were a plague, sweeping through towns like a wildfire, leaving nothing but ash and blood in their wake. By 1873, the Bartlett Gang had become infamous across the Wyoming Territory. They were killers, thieves, and marauders, their crimes growing bolder with each passing month. Banks were emptied, trains derailed, and lawmen gunned down in the streets. No one had been able to stop them. No one had dared to try, until now. Marshal Elias Grey was not a man who sought fame or glory. He was a man of quiet resolve, a lawman who had seen the worst the West had to offer and still believed in the fragile idea of justice. He had spent years chasing men like Bartlett, men who thought they could carve their own kingdoms out of the wilderness with bullets and blood. But Bartlett was different. He wasn't just another outlaw. He was a symbol of everything Elias had sworn to fight against. Elias knew he couldn't take down Bartlett alone. The gang was too large, too ruthless, and too cunning for one man to handle. So he gathered a team, a band of misfits and experts, each with their own reasons for joining the hunt. There was Annie McGraw, the wild sharpshooter who had grown up with a rifle in her hands and a chip on her shoulder. Doc Harlan, the grizzled bounty hunter with a quick draw and a quicker wit. Caleb Boone, the tracker who could read the land like a book. And Maria Vega, the former Pinkerton agent who had spent her life hunting men like Bartlett. Together, they would ride into the heart of the wilderness, into the lawless lands where Bartlett and his men ruled. It would be a fight unlike any they had faced before, a battle of wits, skill, and sheer willpower. The odds were against them, but Elias Grey had never been one to back down from a fight. The West was changing. The railroads were carving through the land, bringing with them the promise of civilization and the shadow of greed. But for every step forward, there were men like Bartlett, determined to drag the frontier back into chaos. Elias knew that if he failed, the Bartlett Gang would become a legend, their crimes inspiring a new generation of outlaws to rise in their place. This was more than a hunt. It was a reckoning, and Elias Grey was ready. Chapter 1. The Dust Settles. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth of the Wyoming Territory. A faint breeze stirred the dust, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and the distant echo of hoofbeats. The town of Red Bluff sat quiet, its wooden buildings weathered and leaning, as if the years had worn them down to match the weary souls who called it home. But the quiet was deceptive. Trouble had passed through here, and it had left its mark. Marshal Elias Grey stood in the middle of the street, his boots planted firmly in the dirt. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by years of hard living and harder choices. His gray eyes scanned the town, taking in the shattered windows of the saloon, the bullet holes peppering the sheriff's office, and the bloodstains that hadn't yet been scrubbed from the boardwalk. The Bartlett Gang had been here, and they'd left their calling card in the form of chaos and death. Elias adjusted the brim of his hat, his jaw tightening. He'd been chasing the Bartlett Gang for months now, tracking their movements across the frontier. They were a ruthless band of outlaws, led by the cunning and brutal Silas Bartlett. Bank robberies, train heists, and cold-blooded murders were their trade, and they left no witnesses behind. Red Bluff was just the latest in a long line of towns to feel their wrath. Behind Elias, a small group of townsfolk had gathered, their faces pale and drawn. They looked to him with a mix of hope and fear, as if he were the only thing standing between them and the lawless wilderness that seemed to creep closer every day. He didn't blame them. The law was a fragile thing out here, and men like Silas Bartlett thrived on its weakness. A voice broke the silence. "Marshal Grey, you think you can stop him?" It was the town's blacksmith, a burly man with soot-streaked hands and a nervous twitch in his eye. Elias turned to face him, his expression grim. "I don't think," he said. "I know, but it won't be easy." The blacksmith nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "They killed Sheriff Tate," he muttered. "Shot him down like a dog in the street. What makes you think you'll fare any better?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a wanted poster with Silas Bartlett's face staring back at him. The reward was high, but it wasn't the money that drove Elias. It was the principle. Men like Bartlett couldn't be allowed to run free, not while he still had breath in his body. "I've got a team," Elias said finally, "and we're not like the sheriff. We're ready for Bartlett and his men." The blacksmith raised an eyebrow. "A team? What kind of team?" Elias allowed himself a faint smile. The kind that knows how to fight fire with fire. As if on cue, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and a rider appeared at the edge of town. She was young, no more than 20, with wild auburn hair that spilled out from under her hat and a rifle slung across her back. Her horse was a lean, muscular Mustang, and she rode it with the ease of someone who had spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground. The townsfolk parted as she rode up to Elias, her sharp green eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. She dismounted in one fluid motion, her boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. "Marshal," she said, her voice low and steady. "You called for me?" Elias nodded. "Good to see you, Annie. I trust you brought your rifle." Annie McGraw patted the weapon on her back. "Never leave home without it." Annie was a sharpshooter, one of the best Elias had ever seen. She'd grown up in the wilds of the West, raised by a father who'd taught her to shoot before she could read. Life had been hard on her, and it showed in the way she carried herself, confident but always on edge, like a coiled spring ready to snap. She was the kind of person you wanted on your side in a fight, and Elias was glad to have her. Another rider appeared, this one an older man with a grizzled beard and a pair of revolvers strapped to his hips. He tipped his hat to Elias as he approached. "Marshal," he said, "looks like you've got yourself a mess here." "Good to see you, Doc," Elias replied. "You ready for this?" Doc Harlan was a former bounty hunter, a man with a reputation for being as quick with his wits as he was with his guns. He'd earned his nickname not because he was a doctor, but because he had a knack for patching people up after a fight, assuming they were still breathing. He was a pragmatist, the kind of man who didn't waste words or bullets. "I'm always ready," Doc said, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the town. "Where's the rest of the team?" "They'll be here," Elias said. "We've got a long ride ahead of us, and I want everyone together before we set out." Annie crossed her arms. "You think Bartlett's still close?" Elias nodded. "He's not far. His gang hit the bank in Red Bluff, but they didn't take everything. That means they're planning something bigger. We need to catch them before they do." Doc grunted. "Easier said than done. Bartlett's slippery, and his men are loyal. They won't go down without a fight." "I'm counting on it," Elias said. His voice was calm, but there was a steely determination in his eyes. He'd faced men like Bartlett before, and he knew what it would take to bring them down. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be clean, but it had to be done. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shadow, Elias turned to his team. "Get some rest," he said. "We ride at first light." Annie and Doc nodded, and the three of them headed for the saloon, where the barkeep was already lighting the lamps. The townsfolk watched them go, their whispers carrying on the wind. They didn't know if Elias Grey and his team could stop the Bartlett Gang, but they were willing to hope. Out here, hope was sometimes all you had. Elias paused at the door of the saloon, glancing back at the darkened street. Somewhere out there, Silas Bartlett was planning his next move. But Elias wasn't afraid. He'd faced worse than Bartlett in his time, and he'd come out the other side. This was just another fight, another battle in the endless war between order and chaos. And Elias Grey wasn't about to lose. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The morning came with a pale golden light that stretched across the Wyoming plains, painting the land in hues of amber and rust. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and the promise of another dry, unforgiving day. Marshal Elias Grey stood by the hitching post outside the saloon, tightening the cinch on his horse's saddle. His gray eyes scanned the horizon, ever watchful, ever calculating. Today, the hunt for the Bartlett Gang would begin in earnest. Behind him, the saloon doors creaked open, and Annie McGraw stepped out, her rifle slung over her shoulder. She looked as sharp and restless as ever, her wild auburn hair catching the morning light. She adjusted her hat and gave Elias a nod. "Doc's still inside," she said. "Says he needs coffee before he can think straight." Elias smirked faintly. "Let him have it. We'll need his wits about him soon enough." Annie leaned against the post, her green eyes narrowing as she gazed out at the open plains. "You think Bartlett knows we're coming?" "He knows someone's after him," Elias replied. "He always does, but he doesn't know it's us. Not yet." Annie's lips curled into a sly grin. "Good. I'd like to catch him off guard for once." The sound of boots on wood drew their attention, and Doc Harlan emerged from the saloon, a tin cup of coffee in one hand and a cigar in the other. His grizzled face was set in its usual expression of mild irritation, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Morning," he grunted, taking a sip of his coffee. "What's the plan, Marshal?" Elias straightened, his hands resting on his belt. "We ride north. Bartlett's gang was spotted near the Powder River 2 days ago. If they're sticking to their usual pattern, They'll be heading for the rail line next. There's a shipment of gold scheduled to pass through the area in 3 days. Doc raised an eyebrow. You think they're after the train? I'd bet on it, Elias said. Bartlett's not the type to let an opportunity like that slip by. But we're not going to wait for him to make his move. We'll cut him off before he gets the chance. Annie's grin widened. Sounds like a fight waiting to happen. It will be, Elias said. Bartlett's men are loyal and they're dangerous. But we've got the advantage. We know how they operate, and we've got the element of surprise. Doc took a long drag on his cigar, exhaling a plume of smoke. You're forgetting one thing, Marshal. Bartlett's got numbers. Last I heard, he's riding with at least a dozen men. That's a lot of guns to go up against. Elias nodded. That's why we're not doing this alone. As if on cue, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the street, and 2 riders appeared at the edge of town. The first was a wiry man with a weathered face and a pair of Colt revolvers strapped to his hips. His name was Caleb Boone, and he was a tracker, one of the best in the territory. He had a knack for reading the land, for finding trails that others missed. If anyone could follow Bartlett's movements, it was him. The second rider was a woman, tall and lean, with dark hair tied back in a braid and a shotgun resting across her lap. Her name was Maria Vega, and she was a former Pinkerton agent with a reputation for being as ruthless as she was resourceful. She'd spent years hunting criminals across the West, and she had no patience for outlaws like Bartlett. The 2 riders dismounted and approached the group, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Marshal, Caleb said, tipping his hat. Heard you've got a job for us. Elias nodded. Glad you could make it. We're going after Bartlett. Maria's dark eyes flicked to Elias, then to Annie and Doc. You've got a good team here, she said. But Bartlett's no ordinary outlaw. He's smart, and he's got men who'd die for him. You sure we're ready for this? We don't have a choice, Elias said. If we don't stop him now, more people are going to die. I won't let that happen. Maria studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'm in. Caleb grinned. You know me, Marshal. I never could resist a good chase. Elias allowed himself a small smile. Good. Then let's get moving. We've got a long ride ahead of us. The group mounted their horses, the sound of leather creaking and hooves striking dirt filling the air. As they rode out of Red Bluff, the townsfolk watched from their windows and doorways, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. They knew the Bartlett Gang was a force to be reckoned with, but they also knew that if anyone could stop them, it was Elias Grey and his team. The trail north was rough and winding, cutting through rocky hills and sparse patches of scrubland. Caleb rode at the front, his keen eyes scanning the ground for signs of the gang's passage. He pointed out faint tracks and broken branches, piecing together a trail that only he could see. They're moving fast, Caleb said after a while. But they're not being careful. They think they're ahead of us. Good, Elias said. Let them think that. As the day wore on, the group fell into a steady rhythm, their horses' hooves pounding against the earth. They spoke little, each of them focused on the task ahead. The Bartlett Gang was out there, somewhere in the vast expanse of the Wyoming wilderness, and every step brought them closer to a confrontation that none of them could avoid. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the group had reached a small rocky outcrop overlooking a wide valley. Caleb dismounted and crouched down, studying the ground. They camped here last night, he said, pointing to the remains of a fire pit. They're not far, maybe a day ahead of us. Elias nodded. We'll make camp here for the night. Get some rest. Tomorrow we close the gap. The group set up a small camp, their fire burning low to avoid drawing attention. As they ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack, the conversation turned to the task ahead. You think Bartlett knows we're this close? Annie asked, her voice low. He'll know soon enough, Elias said, but by then it'll be too late. Maria leaned back against a rock, her shotgun resting across her lap. I've hunted men like Bartlett before, she said. They're dangerous because they think they're untouchable, but they all make mistakes eventually. Elias stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Bartlett's mistake was underestimating us, and we're going to make sure he pays for it. The group fell silent, the weight of the coming battle settling over them like a heavy blanket. They all knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. The Bartlett Gang had terrorized the West for too long, and it was time to put an end to their reign of violence. As the stars began to fill the night sky, Elias lay back against his saddle, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Somewhere out there, Silas Bartlett was planning his next move. But Elias wasn't afraid. He'd faced worse than Bartlett before, and he'd always come out on top. This time would be no different. Chapter 3. The Ambush. The morning broke cold and quiet, the kind of stillness that made even the birds hesitate to sing. The campfire had long since burned down to embers, and the group was already saddling their horses, their breath visible in the crisp air. Marshal Elias Grey stood at the edge of the rocky outcrop, his eyes fixed on the valley below. The trail was clear now, a faint line of hoofprints cutting through the dirt and leading north toward the Powder River. Bartlett's gang was close, too close for comfort. "Tracks are fresh," Caleb Boone said, crouching near the edge of the camp. His fingers brushed the dirt, his sharp eyes scanning the faint impressions left behind. "They passed through here not more than a few hours ago. They're moving fast, but they're not trying to hide their trail." "They're getting cocky," Maria Vega said, tightening the strap on her saddle. "That's good. Overconfidence makes men sloppy." "Sloppy or not, they've got numbers," Doc Harlan muttered, checking the chambers of his revolver. "We're still outgunned." Elias turned to face the group, his expression calm but resolute. "We've got something they don't," he said. "We've got the element of surprise. Bartlett doesn't know we're this close, and we're going to use that to our advantage." Annie McGraw leaned against her horse, her rifle resting casually in her hands. "So what's the plan, Marshal? We ride in guns blazing, or are we playing this smart?" Elias allowed himself a faint smile. "Smart. Bartlett's men are dangerous, but they're not disciplined. If we can catch them off guard, we can split them up and take them down before they have a chance to regroup." Maria nodded. "Divide and conquer. I like it." Caleb stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "There's a narrow pass about 5 miles north of here," he said. "If they're heading for the river, they'll have to go through it. It's the only way through the hills." Elias's eyes narrowed. "A choke point. Perfect for an ambush." Annie grinned. "Now you're talking my language." The group mounted their horses, the tension in the air palpable as they set off at a steady pace. The trail wound through rocky terrain, the landscape growing more rugged with each passing mile. The hills rose up around them, their jagged peaks casting long shadows across the ground. It was the kind of place where danger could be lurking around every corner, and every member of the group kept their weapons close at hand. By the time they reached the pass, the sun was high in the sky, its light casting harsh contrasts across the rocky terrain. The pass was narrow, flanked on either side by steep cliffs that loomed like silent sentinels. It was the perfect place for an ambush, both for them and for Bartlett's gang. Caleb dismounted, his eyes scanning the ground. "They're coming this way," he said, pointing to a set of fresh tracks. "Shouldn't be more than an hour behind us." Elias nodded. "Good. We'll set up here. Caleb, you and Maria take the high ground on the east side. Annie, you're with me on the west. Doc, you stay back with the horses. If things go south, we'll need a quick getaway." Doc frowned but didn't argue. "Just don't get yourselves killed," he said, pulling a flask from his coat and taking a swig. The group moved quickly, each member taking their position with practiced efficiency. Caleb and Maria climbed the rocky slope on the east side of the pass, their movements silent and deliberate. Annie followed Elias up the west side, her rifle slung across her back. The climb was steep, but neither of them complained. They'd done this kind of thing before, and they both knew the importance of staying quiet. When they reached their vantage point, Elias crouched behind a boulder, his eyes scanning the pass below. Annie settled in beside him, her rifle resting on the rock in front of her. "You think this'll work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It has to," Elias replied. "Bartlett's men are dangerous, but they're not invincible. If we hit them hard and fast, we can take them down before they know what's happening." Annie smirked. "Hard and fast. I like the sound of that." Elias didn't respond. His focus was on the trail below, his sharp eyes watching for any sign of movement. The minutes stretched on, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of the wind through the rocks. Then, at last, he saw them. The Bartlett gang rode into the pass in a loose formation, their horses kicking up dust as they moved. There were 12 of them, just as Caleb had said, and they looked every bit as dangerous as their reputation suggested. At the head of the group was Silas Bartlett himself, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a pair of pistols strapped to his hips. His eyes were sharp, scanning the terrain with the wariness of a man who'd spent his life looking over his shoulder. Elias's hand tightened on the grip of his revolver. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. "Wait for my signal," he whispered to Annie. She nodded, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of her rifle. Her green eyes were locked on the gang below, her expression calm and focused. On the other side of the pass, Caleb and Maria were in position, their weapons trained on the outlaws. Caleb gave a small nod, signaling that he was ready. Maria's shotgun gleamed in the sunlight, her finger hovering over the trigger. Elias took a deep breath, his heart steady despite the tension in the air. Then, with a sharp whistle, he gave the signal. The first shot rang out, echoing through the pass like a crack of thunder. Annie's rifle barked, and one of Bartlett's men toppled from his horse, a red stain spreading across his chest. Chaos erupted as the gang scrambled for cover, their shouts filling the air. Elias fired next, his revolver kicking in his hand as he took down another outlaw. Caleb and Maria opened fire from the other side, their bullets cutting through the gang's ranks with deadly precision. The outlaws returned fire, their pistols and rifles flashing in the sunlight, but they were caught off guard, their formation broken. Silas Bartlett shouted orders, his voice booming over the chaos. "Spread out! Find them! Don't let them pin us down!" Elias ducked behind the boulder as a bullet ricocheted off the rock, sending shards of stone flying. He reloaded quickly, his movements practiced and efficient. "Annie, keep them pinned down. Don't let them regroup." "On it!" Annie called back, her rifle cracking as she fired another shot. Another outlaw fell, his body crumpling to the ground. The fight was brutal and fast, the air filled with the sound of gunfire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The Bartlett gang was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, but they fought with the desperation of men who knew they had nothing to lose. Elias's eyes locked on Silas Bartlett, who had taken cover behind a fallen log. The outlaw leader's eyes burned with fury as he fired at Caleb and Maria, his movements quick and precise. He was a skilled fighter, and Elias knew he wouldn't go down easily. "Bartlett's mine," Elias muttered, his jaw tightening. He rose from cover, his revolver in hand, and began to move toward the outlaw leader. The ambush had worked, but the fight was far from over. Chapter 4. The Devil's Gambit. The air was thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, and the echoes of gunfire ricocheted off the rocky walls of the pass. Marshal Elias Grey moved with purpose, his revolver steady in his hand as he advanced toward Silas Bartlett's position. The outlaw leader was pinned behind a fallen log, his pistol barking out shots at Caleb and Maria on the opposite ridge. Bartlett's men were scattered, their numbers dwindling under the relentless assault, but the fight was far from over. Elias ducked behind a boulder as a bullet whizzed past his head, kicking up a spray of dirt. He glanced over at Annie McGraw, who was perched higher up on the ridge, her rifle trained on the outlaws below. She fired again, her shot striking true as another of Bartlett's men crumpled to the ground. "Keep them pinned!" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Annie grinned, her green eyes alight with the thrill of the fight. "Don't worry, Marshal. I've got plenty of bullets left." On the other side of the pass, Caleb Boone and Maria Vega were holding their ground, their shots precise and deadly. Caleb's revolvers barked in quick succession, each shot finding its mark, while Maria's shotgun roared, the sound reverberating through the narrow canyon. The Bartlett gang was outmatched, their initial confidence shattered by the ambush, but they fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Silas Bartlett, however, was no ordinary outlaw. Even under fire, he moved with a calculated precision, his sharp eyes scanning the battlefield for an opening. He barked orders to his remaining men, his voice carrying over the din of the fight. "Flank them! Get up the ridge and take them out!" Bartlett roared, his voice filled with fury. Two of his men broke from cover, scrambling up the rocky slope toward Annie's position. Elias saw them and fired, his revolver kicking in his hand. One of the outlaws fell, clutching his chest, but the other kept climbing, his rifle slung across his back. "Annie, watch your flank!" Elias called out. "I see him!" Annie replied, her voice steady. She swung her rifle around, her movements quick and practiced. The outlaw was almost on her when she fired, the shot echoing through the pass. He tumbled backward, his body rolling down the slope before coming to a stop in the dirt below. Elias turned his attention back to Bartlett, who was still firing from behind the log. The outlaw leader's eyes locked on Elias, and for a moment, the two men stared each other down across the battlefield. Bartlett's lips curled into a sneer, and he raised his pistol, firing a shot that struck the boulder Elias was using for cover. "You're a long way from winning this, Marshal," Bartlett shouted, his voice dripping with defiance. Elias didn't respond. He reloaded his revolver with practiced efficiency, his mind focused on the task at hand. Bartlett was dangerous, but Elias had faced men like him before. He knew that the key to winning this fight was patience and precision. The gunfire began to die down as the last of Bartlett's men fell. Caleb and Maria descended from their position, their weapons still drawn as they moved cautiously through the pass. Annie climbed down from her perch, her rifle slung over her shoulder, and joined Elias near the center of the battlefield. "That's most of them," Caleb said, his voice low. "But Bartlett's still breathing." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the fallen log where Bartlett was hiding. "He won't be for long." Maria stepped forward, her shotgun at the ready. Let's finish this. Elias raised a hand, stopping her. No, Bartlett's mine. Maria hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. The group spread out, their weapons trained on Bartlett's position as Elias advanced. The outlaw leader was crouched low behind the log, his pistol in one hand and a knife in the other. His eyes burned with a mix of fury and desperation as he watched Elias approach. You think you've won, Marshal? Bartlett growled, his voice low and venomous. You think killing me will change anything? Elias stopped a few paces away, his revolver aimed squarely at Bartlett's chest. It'll stop you from killing anyone else. Bartlett laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You're a fool if you think this ends with me. There's always another man ready to take my place. That's the way of the West, Marshal. Men like me don't die. We multiply. Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't waver. Maybe, but you won't be around to see it. Bartlett's sneer faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. You're a brave man, Grey. I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you. Before Elias could respond, Bartlett moved. He threw the knife in his hand, the blade flashing in the sunlight as it hurtled toward Elias. The marshal sidestepped, the knife grazing his arm and drawing a thin line of blood. Bartlett used the distraction to lunge forward, his pistol raised. Elias fired, the shot striking Bartlett in the shoulder and spinning him around. The outlaw staggered but didn't fall, his pistol still clutched in his hand. He raised it again, his face twisted in pain and rage, but Elias was faster. He fired a second shot, this one striking Bartlett square in the chest. Bartlett stumbled backward, his pistol falling from his hand as he collapsed to the ground. He gasped for breath, his eyes wide with shock as blood spread across his shirt. Elias approached cautiously, his revolver still trained on the fallen outlaw. Bartlett looked up at him, his lips curling into a faint, defiant smile. You think you've won, he rasped, his voice barely audible. But this is just the beginning. Elias didn't respond. He watched as the life faded from Bartlett's eyes, the outlaw's body going still. The fight was over. The rest of the group approached, their weapons lowered, but their expressions wary. Caleb knelt beside Bartlett's body, checking for a pulse before shaking his head. He's done, Caleb said. It's over. Elias holstered his revolver, his expression grim. Not yet. We still need to make sure the rest of his men are accounted for. Maria nodded. We'll round up the bodies. If any of them are still breathing, we'll take them back to Red Bluff for trial. Annie stepped up beside Elias, her rifle resting against her shoulder. You all right, Marshal? That knife got you pretty good. Elias glanced at the cut on his arm, the blood already beginning to dry. I'll live, Annie smirked. Good. Wouldn't want to lose you now, not after all this. Elias allowed himself a faint smile, but his mind was already elsewhere. Bartlett was dead, but the outlaw's words lingered in his mind. This is just the beginning. The West was a wild, untamed place, and men like Bartlett were a symptom of a deeper sickness. Elias knew that as long as greed and lawlessness ruled the frontier, there would always be another fight waiting for him. But for now, the Bartlett Gang was no more, and the people of Red Bluff could sleep a little easier. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now.
Thanks for riding along, partner. If you enjoyed this tale from the wild frontier, give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Until next time, keep your boots dusty and your aim true.